Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Carry Me Home, Birmingham, Alabama, the Climactic Battle of the Civil Rights Revolution, by Diane McWhorter. Narrated by Exie Sands. Author's note: like many histories of the Civil Rights era, Carry Me Home sometimes uses the word Negro to refer to African Americans. This was the cross-racial designation of respect from that period. The term of disrespect will be read here as an "mm-mm." A landscape to be seen has to be composed, and to be loved has to be moralized. George Santayana, The Sense of Beauty. Preface. Like the spiritual from which the title is taken, this book is about death, redemption, and race. It builds to the national turning point known in history as the Year of Birmingham, 1963, when two things happened there in the country's most segregated city that brought about the end of apartheid in America. The first milestone was the huge nonviolent demonstrations that Martin Luther King Jr. staged in the spring as school-age witnesses for justice overcame the weapons of the state, including Commissioner Bull Connor's police dogs and fire hoses. The spectacle, something that seemed to belong in the Old Testament rather than the American mid-century, nationalized the faltering civil rights movement and galvanized public opinion behind federal legislation to abolish segregation. But because this battle over black freedom was, in effect, a continuation of the Civil War, there were bound to be casualties. The second of the emblematic events in Birmingham, as President John F. Kennedy referred to the inspiration for his own Emancipation Proclamation, the bill eventually passed as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was the Ku Klux Klan's bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. In some ghoulish symmetry with the youth triumph of the spring, 4 black Sunday school girls were killed by the explosion. I was a citizen of Birmingham in 1963. Close to the age of the girls who died in the bombing. But I was growing up on the wrong side of the revolution. I knew nothing of what was happening downtown, even though my father, the renegade son of a prominent white Birmingham family, was taking an increasingly active role in opposing Martin Luther King's movement. In my quest to understand how a family of Ivy League-educated country clubbers could have produced a vigilante spirit like my father, I ended up discovering that the elite establishment of the city itself had nurtured the Ku Klux Klan and created the brutal conditions that incited a magnificent nonviolent revolution. My education did not begin until after college, when I was living in Boston. The book review editor at an alternative weekly gave me, as a native of the tragic comic land of George Wallace, a copy of the Alabama volume in a 1976 bicentennial series on the 50 states, not to review, God knows, but to get it off his shelf. Several years later, I finally opened the book, expecting the coverage of my city to be a salute to the Pittsburgh of the South. What I found instead would change my life, embarking me on a 15-year expedition back to Birmingham. The author of that bicentennial tribute, a local historian named Virginia Vanderveer Hamilton, described the role of the power structure of Birmingham, the fathers and grandfathers of my schoolmates, who had materialized in the Chamber of Commerce building on a Tuesday in May 1963 to figure out how to make Martin Luther King stop the mass marches. They were so afraid of the social and economic consequences of dealing with King that only one man would agree to negotiate with him. He was a real estate executive named Sidney Smyer, and he was my cousin. It was only then that I realized that the events in Birmingham had anything to do with me. The kinship between the Smyers and the McWhorters owed more to the place we had in common than to the distant ancestor we shared, one Lucy Haney Harris, a South Carolinian of colonial Virginian stock. We were descendants of the tiny town of Galesville, Cherokee County, Alabama, of the Confederate States of America. There, in October 1864, Union troops bivouacked beside the Chattooga River within view of the McWhorter plantation. My great-great-grandmother, whose husband, a regimental surgeon of the 47th Infantry, was at the Confederate hospital in Richmond, led a delegation of local women over to the encampment and asked an unprepossessing man who identified himself as General Sherman if he would spare the gristmill downriver. "Madam," he replied gallantly, If you ladies will recall your husbands and your brothers from the Army of the Confederacy, I shall be only too happy to leave it." Watching their main food source go up in Union flames, the community of women and children witnessed the beginning of the first modern war against a civilian society, and the end of the great Confederate experiment. Sherman had earlier that month conceived his march smashing things to the sea to make Georgia howl. Nearly a century later, in 1963, Sid Smyer found himself in the middle of a later war over emancipation, engineering the terms of the decisive battle. But it turns out that Smyer was a far more complicated character than the white savior of Birmingham that history would make him out to be. For nearly 3 decades, as businessman, politician, and even churchman, he had led the polite resistance to civil rights. He had also bankrolled a man who became one of the city's most rabid Klansmen. A hero as perverse as the city's history. "I'm a segregationist," he said to explain his change of heart, "but I'm not a damn fool." Smyer embodied Birmingham's transformation from the Johannesburg of America to the proving ground of the civil rights movement. Birmingham was different than other cities. It was southern, and it had industry, steel, the business that built America. And because it had industry, it had a noteworthy concentration of workers, and because the workers were treated badly by the industrialists, the labor movement, as well as the Communist Party, paid Birmingham special attention, introducing it to a tradition of organized protest unheard of elsewhere in the South. The forces of progress, however, had been no sweat for the forces of money until President Franklin D. Roosevelt sensationally wheeled the U.S. government around to the side of the have-nots in the 1930s, empowering the workers to unite against their bosses. And that is where the story of 1963 really begins. At the time, Sid Smyer's own public career was launched during the New Deal, when segregation itself was not only a racist ideology, but also a means to an economic end. The civil rights movement was created from the rib of organized labor, and the industrialists answered it with a grassroots counteroffensive of hooded vigilantes and the queerest Tory politician in history, a loudmouthed hick named Bull Connor. The saga of African-American liberation is perhaps the most thrilling in our country's history, biblical in its subtexts and angles of moral instruction. But even though this book traces the movement through its prime in Birmingham and offers a somewhat unorthodox pre-glory view of Martin Luther King, it is not merely about the civil rights struggle. I hope it also sheds insight on the segregationists and the respectable underpinnings of their violent resistance. Because of the city's industrially stratified demographics, the influence of class was more pronounced there than in other places in the South. The conflict that made Birmingham America's racial Armageddon in 1963 was the class warfare that had always threatened the confidence of a young nation founded on the preposterous principle of equality. Diane McWhorter, New York City, September 2000. Introduction. September 15th, 1963. By noon that Sunday, people were arriving at the Mountain Brook Club's downstairs grill, soothingly dark, as if it had been designed with the hangover in mind. The after-church buffet table was spread with steamship roast beef, very rare, crab meat au gratin, shrimp creole, sweet potato and miniature marshmallow casserole, fresh turnip greens with homemade relish, and salads featuring canned white asparagus and Roquefort, never blue cheese, dressing. Amid this plenty, a sparse plate was the badge of one-upmanship. The diners had a heavy-lidded, slow-glanced look, the air of having gotten there first and fashionably late at the same time. Theirs was a snobbery so exquisite that an evening over at the Birmingham Country Club, that roadhouse, my uncle sneered charmingly, what with its ranch architecture and the acres of parking lot visible from the street, was considered slumming. The Mountain Brook was a whitewashed brick plantation-style mansion with tastefully unassertive columns, nestled in a piney glen. Sometimes a Mountain Brook man would deign to point out that the difference between the Birmingham and his club was the difference between Kiwanis, which ran the city, and Rotary, which owned it. The emotional distinction? Some of my best friends belonged to the Birmingham, but I wouldn't want my caddy working for them. For us children, the privilege of belonging meant that you knew which one of your friends didn't, the same way you knew whose parents were divorced, whose father drank, who was a Catholic, and you instinctively redesigned your remarks mid-sentence, if necessary, not to call attention to the misfortune. My grandfather had been a charter member of the Mountain Brook, and his younger son, my Uncle Hobart, felt entitled enough to indulge in unbecoming behavior, like flinging his racket down on the tennis court after a blown point, with a strangled cry of, "God bless America!" My father was another story. He had grown up at the club from infancy, swimming in its pool right through the polio scare, but he would not have been admitted there as an adult, even if he had wanted to be. The shaky class structure on which Birmingham was built could disintegrate within a single family, in a single generation. I was 10 years old, and because my family was prominent enough to socially withstand any mortification my father could bring it, the Mountain Brook Club was the center of my universe. I would not understand for 25 years that it also contained the secrets to this fateful Sunday in 1963, when Birmingham earned a permanent place in history, not for the first time this year. Most of America knew of my city only as a sort of race circus, redneck freaks and Jim Crow wretches clashing under the live fireworks of Birmingham. But behind the scenes was a third set of principals, from whom I was learning the ordinary rituals of prosperity at the Mountain Brook Club. As the impresarios, they had provided the original economic motive for the gaudy performers, whom they themselves had lost sight of and finally disavowed. The club's patriarchs, officially only men could belong, were known statewide as Big Mules, a perhaps unconscious tribute to the most prized members of the largely black workforce that excavated their fortunes in coal and iron. "How many mules did we lose?" was their half-facetious response to a big mine explosion. Founded after the Civil War, the heavy manufacturing mecca of the South had been built by post-emancipation slaves. Under a system popular all around the old Confederacy, known as the convict lease, the state of Alabama hired out half its prisoners to the tuberculosis-breeding coal mines of Birmingham's founding industrialists. The crimes of these mine slaves, the vast majority of them black, were often nothing more than gambling, indebtedness, or idleness. Young first offenders faced a double punishment as gal boys for the hardened criminals. The system had all the evils of slavery without one of its ameliorating features, as one critic noted, like the slave owners' vested interest in keeping their property alive. Slackers were hung on crosses, though with ropes rather than nails. Fugitives were mauled by bloodhounds, and then whipped with wet leather straps until they begged for death. Those who got their wish were dumped in a common hole in the woods, saving the superintendent the nuisance of a funeral appearance. The lease raised money for the state, at the same time that it provided the industrialists a cheap, strike-proof workforce and a sense of moral purpose, for they insisted that a mine sentence was the best way to teach ignorant Negroes the lessons of citizenship. The descendants of Birmingham's founding convict drivers were now the most venerated members of the Mountain Brook Club. One of them would soon lead the opposition to a campaign among the younger members to expand the club's parking facilities and, by extension, the circle of exclusivity that the ironmakers shared with Ivy League-trained attorneys for the splendid corporations who, like my grandfather, had earned the accolade great lawyer. One Mountain Brook Club member was in a class all by himself. A great man was the way his peers described James Alexander Simpson, a distinguished corporation lawyer, founder of a bank, husband to a pedigree, and statesman. He was an imposing man with a handsome face composed dourly to convey toughness, the ultimate Birmingham virtue. His unapproachable bearing had prompted friend and foe to satirize him as Sunny Jim during the years he ruled the state legislature, where he was so attentive to the needs of business that he had fought for the unfettered entrepreneurship of loan sharks. It was the convert zeal that had made him a larger-than-life member of his adopted aristocracy. For this confirmed elitist, the state's foremost capitalist ideologue, was the son of a communist. Acquaintances still hailed Simpson as senator, to acknowledge not his beautifully crafted contributions to the state code as a state senator, but his one thwarted ambition, to be elected to the U.S. Senate. His 1944 campaign for the office, even though unsuccessful, had invented the future of politics in Alabama, one based on frank, unapologetic racism. And so it was that Simpson had created the enemies who had defined Black America's struggle for freedom in this year of 1963, the Year of Birmingham. when segregation fell. The most infamous of those enemies was Eugene Bull Connor, a former cornball radio personality whom Simpson had molded into the czar of Birmingham City Hall. The two men had written the laws, punished the dissenters, and generally made democracy safe for Simpson's mighty clients. Simpson's intimates were hard-pressed to understand what this great man could possibly have to do with the rube who signed official correspondence Eugene Bull Connor in the rotund letters of someone proud of having mastered cursive writing. At least old Bull's honest, the clubmen chanted, and when they mocked his gorgeous malapropisms, white and Negro are not to segregate together, they did so with the same good-humored headshake that punctuated their stories about the yardman's car breaking down again. The closest Simpson got to apologizing for Connor was to say, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's my son of a bitch. Their teamwork had produced the country's purest example of segregation, a civilization more peculiar than slavery, from which it had mutated. And that explained how Martin Luther King Jr. happened to have landed in town in the spring of 1963. Birmingham had become the do-or-die test for the civil rights movement, what King had pronounced the most segregated city in America. It was the dreaded destination he had been hoping to avoid during the 7 years since a bus boycott in Montgomery baptized him as the Negro people's savior, America's Gandhi, according to Time magazine. But now the mantra of King's aides was, as Birmingham goes, so goes the South. From the relative safety of Atlanta, King had watched the trials of his Birmingham colleague Fred Lee Shuttlesworth, the proud creature of a city he said had a heart as hard as the steel it manufactures and as black as the coal it mines. Shuttlesworth's ramrod carriage, arrogantly tilted head, and harsh intelligence contained in the package of an unpolished, rabble-rousing Baptist preacher contrasted with the Reverend Dr. King's intellectual Hamlet image as the pampered product of the black bourgeoisie. Within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization he and King had founded, Shuttlesworth's appalling courage had earned him the nickname the Wild Man of Birmingham. He had been bombed, whipped with chains, and subjected to a Chinese water torture dribble of legal harassments. His response had been, "We mean to kill segregation or be killed by it." By finally goading the movement to take on Birmingham, Shuttlesworth had brought King to the crossroads of his career and of the long, rough passage of their people. Frankly, Jim Simpson had not seen why there had been all that fuss about Bulls using the police dogs and the fire hoses against King and the outside agitators who had rioted in Birmingham streets that spring. That was just standard police procedure for crowd control. The national news media had overblown King's show, all those marches just for the right to eat a hot dog at a lunch counter. And even so, it might have all gone away, but for that news photograph of a colored boy who had stepped into the jaws of one of the German police dogs. As Eric Severide said on the CBS Evening News, a snarling police dog set upon a human being is recorded in the permanent photoelectric file of every human being's brain. Where the photographer had made it look as if the dog were attacking the youth, the Mountain Brook Club members knew that he was really being restrained on his leash by his officer. German Shepherds had been treated as VIPs ever since the city acquired them in 1961. Sergeant M.W. McBride had recently brought his partner, Rebel, to our morning school assembly, where the dog dutifully attacked a policewoman in a protective suit, playing the role of suspect. The awe-inspiring performance had caused me briefly to abandon my ambition to make the U.S. equestrian team in favor of becoming a handler for the Canine Corps. The local papers had had the good sense not to print the famous photo, but we would have recognized the victim generically as one of the colored boys we saw pedaling undersized bikes with flat tires as we drove through rundown neighborhoods on our way to football games at Legion Field, and, assuming that the youths were budding juvenile delinquents, rolled up the car windows. I had no idea that I was growing up under the reign of James A. Simpson, even though I had attended 1st through 4th grade with his grandson, James A. Simpson II, at a private school founded to spare our charmed circle of Mountain Brook Club grandchildren from integration. Popsy, as everyone called the boy, was the third generation of my family's friendship with the Simpsons. My grandfather had been a member of the Senator's Kitchen Cabinet in the 1930s, one of the best people of Birmingham trying to redeem the state from the hookwormy masses. Popsy's Uncle Jimmy and my Uncle Hobart had been in each other's weddings, and the senior Simpson's wife still marveled over the time my Ohio-bred grandmother, what would those Yankees think of next, brought a flaming peach dessert to a formal dinner table right in the cast-iron skillet. Popsy Simpson was our class clown. His red skeleton routine at lunch period invariably concluded with the cracking of a hard-boiled egg on his head so that he could feign a concussion. The day Popsy's maid accidentally put an uncooked egg in his lunchbox was the funniest day of primary school, the kind of incident my mother would sorrowfully recall years later when his name was being dragged through the papers in connection with Birmingham's society murder of the century. Even if Popsy's grandfather, the great man himself, had still been alive, it is unlikely he would have discerned in his namesake's sordid fate some rough justice from the gods who bind an individual life to public history. For James A. Simpson, more than any of his esteemed collaborators, bore the political responsibility for what happened on this Sunday, September 15th, 1963. The 16th Street Baptist Church was the city's most elegant black church. It anchored the vital Negro cultural and commercial district a few blocks from the department store where I had bought my pale green Easter dress just before the trouble began that spring. The spacious balconied sanctuary had been the staging ground for Martin Luther King's demonstrations. Marchers gathered there to sing, clap, and pray until they caught the nonviolent spirit. Then they filed out to face Bull Connor and the cameras. The picture of the black boy and the dog had been taken across the street from the church. 16th Street stylish members had considered Crusades for Freedom the business of what they called little uns, and had only grudgingly consented to let King use their building. We're glad that by late summer, the city's police dogs no longer fascinated the news media. King had moved on to Washington, where he had recently stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and spoken to the multitudes about, among other dreams, the redemptive power of unearned suffering. On this Sunday morning in September, 18 days after the March on Washington, there was hardly an activist to be found at the 16th Street Baptist Church, even if it had been stuck with the label headquarters of the Civil Rights Movement, subjecting it to bomb threats it did not deserve. 4 girls about my age slipped out of their Sunday school class and went to a basement restroom to primp. Church clothes were, as white people knew, the acme of the Negro wardrobe, and 16th Street was a continual fashion show. Today, the girls were checking themselves in the mirror before going upstairs to take part in the regular church services for Youth Day, inaugurated by the pastor in the hope of bringing new life to the stodgy congregation. At 10:22, an exploding bundle of dynamite knocked a man-sized hole in the steel-reinforced stone and brick east wall of the church restroom. It blew the clothes off the Sunday school girls and stacked them like cordwood under a blizzard of debris. All 4 were killed. 1 had been decapitated. At the Mountain Brook Club, the waiters, black by club policy, had been the first to know that the 16th Street Baptist Church had been bombed. Some had heard the explosion as they set out for work, momentarily confused by the boom. However commonplace by night, the bombings against blacks had not yet occurred in the daylight hours, let alone on a Sunday morning, in a place that called itself the City of Churches. It had to have been the strangest day yet for the waiters, accustomed though they were to leading what one described as 2 lives, to go to their locker room and change into their tuxedos, uniforms identical to the former leisure attire of the clubmen. The staff was a sort of magic mirror for the members, reflecting a wishful truth that contrasted with the example of previous black employees, the convict miners. "They have it better than we do," the clubmen said of the liveried servants, and pointed out that the late beloved doorman was commemorated at the club entrance with a bronze plaque in memory of Reginald B. Brown, Major Domo, 1930 to 1947. He had supposedly chosen the paternalistic perks of his club career, access to the biggest bankers, doctors, and lawyers in town, over a future in the Negro theater as the next step in Fetch It. It was as if the big mules had forgotten that oppressed, if not enslaved, Negroes were the cornerstone of their industrial success. Segregation, with its sentimental life force, racism, had kept their workers divided, wages depressed. The industrialists had not invented segregation, but they had honed it into the ultimate money-making instrument. Brown's successor as the club's most favored employee in 1963, similarly dignified by being addressed by his last rather than his first name, was the head waiter, Lindsay Gaines, sleek as a fountain pen and openly proud of working at the most prestigious club in the Southeast. Behind his back, his waitstaff called him Mr. Mountain Brook, for Gaines was no slouch in the art of ingratiation, spreading himself like balm over, for example, Jim Simpson's bickering grandchildren, Popsy, and his 3 sisters. When Gaines's brick ranch house was bombed, presumably because it was in a formerly white neighborhood settled by upwardly mobile blacks, he had let his dismay show to the clubmen who handled his insurance. Soon, 2 white deputy sheriffs began standing guard at the house, serving notice on any predators that he was what blacks and whites alike called a white folks The grand dames who played bridge at the club had taken a special interest in him. "Gaines, you're a gentleman," arranging for him to visit the Sheraton Mount Royal at Montreal and the fine dining rooms of New Orleans, where he learned to slice salmon, carve venison, and manipulate 3 saucepans in one hand. The ladies had been the first to introduce on club property the subject of the trouble downtown. One said to Gaines, "What is it y'all want? I do everything but go to bed with you." They would even drop the names of civil rights figures to see if he would take the bait. But Gaines, whom they had taught the value of discretion, never let on what became of some of the bills pressed into his palm after he flambéed the baked Alaska tableside, lowering the lights so that his white shirt and gloves stood out against the fire. The tips would be donated to the cause of Martin Luther King. If our history texts listed Uncle Tom's Cabin among the 4 major causes of the Civil War, so had the photograph of the police dog lunging at the black boy been a factor in the Emancipation Proclamation of the 20th century. President John F. Kennedy went on national TV not long after the photograph was published. It had made him sick, he said, and announced that he was sending to Congress a remedy for the events in Birmingham, the first serious civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, ultimately the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which would end legalized racism in America. Not so long ago, our way of life, as the South preferred to describe segregation, had seemed immutable. The world outlook was bad, yes. Walker Percy would write in The Last Gentleman, his novel set partly on the golf course of the Birmingham Country Club across from where he grew up, but not so bad that it was not a pleasant thing to say so of a gold-green afternoon, with a fair sweat-up and sugared bourbon that tasted as good as it smelled. "I'm going to tell you all the truth," one of the clubmen said, eyeing the distant black caddies waiting for the golfers to finish their whiskey refreshment. "If they want the country all that bad, I'm not all that much against letting them have it." "Ain't nobody here but us anyway," somebody finally answered. "Let's play golf." Those old heavy manufacturing warriors, who now channeled their killer instinct into the dogfights of golfers who teed off at half-hour intervals every Saturday morning, had once engaged in more direct forms of combat, using machine guns and, yes, dynamite, against the presumed enemies of free enterprise, notably the representatives of organized labor. The problem was the vigilantes who had handled the industrialists' dirtiest work had not lost the habit of terrorism, even after it ceased to serve the interests of business. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church was the endgame in the city fathers' long and profitable tradition of maintaining their industrial supremacy through vigilantism. Not that anyone standing in the buffet line that Sunday had anything to do with the lethal package planted during those dark hours before the blast, when no sensible white person would be found in the colored section of downtown. The fuse had been lit years earlier, in the broad daylight of community approval, and even the cleanest hands at the Mountain Brook Club did their bit to keep it dry as it sizzled through bad neighborhoods and across many decades, before it blew up 4 black Sunday school girls on September 15th, 1963. Birmingham was initially envisioned during Reconstruction as a city upon a hill. It was to be the industrial summit of a new South sprung in full glory from the Alabama wilderness, and in its short life it had indeed proved to be a spectacular American archetype, albeit as a city in a valley. My father had been born in the last months of the Roaring '20s, a time when the corporation-building efforts of men like his father had lent a glimmer of authenticity to Birmingham's wild self-promotion, the biggest city in America for its age.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?